So what's the easiest way to spot that a picture is computer generated? In my opinion, this is repeating texture tilings and a lack of randomization. So in this tutorial I will show you how you can use simple techniques in VRay to randomize the look of your model and eliminate repetitions during render time. So let's first compare two different pictures. So one is this one and one is that one. We can clearly see that this picture here looks much more realistic, and the only reason for that is randomizations and surface variations. So if we see the original picture here, we can see, for example, that all the stones, they look very, very similar, and they have this repetitive pattern, for example, this crack that's present on all of the stones. So there's very little variation going on between the stones, and this way it will make it look very computer generated. The same is true for the floor, so we can see those kind of patterns which are always repeating. And in this version here, I try to eliminate all of those issues. So now we're in 3ds Max. This one is the model that we're gonna use. We can see it's already fully collapsed. We can't really access the individual bricks anymore, and it would be very difficult now to change the individual UVs. So luckily VRay offers some ways to modify all of this kind of stuff during render time so that we don't really need to change anything about the model that we have here. So I'm using VRay in the version 5, that's the latest version available at the moment. For previous versions, the workflow is a little bit different, but you can get a similar or the same kind of result, which I'm going to show you at the end of this tutorial. So now in our material editor, we have those 3 textures, which are all piped into the correct slot in our shader. And I have a diffuse map, a normal map, and a roughness map. So the first step that I would recommend to do is to exchange all of those 3ds Max default bitmap nodes to the new VRayBitmap node. So VRayBitmap you can find here. And in earlier versions of VRay, they are called VRayHDRI, but they changed the name because people were thinking it's only useful for HDRI images, but actually this one is the node that should be used now always in VRay instead of the normal 3ds Max bitmap node. So you could either replace it by hand, which is a little bit tedious, or the easier way would be to just go in your viewport, right click, and use this selection here, bitmap to VRayBitmap converter, and it will open this menu. And then if we go in here, we see that those textures here, they are not longer connected, and instead we are now have the same kind of setup that we had before, but the max bitmaps were replaced with the VRay bitmaps. And if we want to see the preview updates, we can also enable auto preview, and then let's make this one bigger. Then we can see more clear. And those ones we get out of the way. So this is now the same setup that what we had before, just that we use VRay bitmaps. So now the first step that we can do is we can, for example, let me just replace this albedo map with a checker map, because then we can see much more clear what's going on. So if I now replace this texture, I can see that every stone has a UV, that's good, but it's using exactly the same UV for every kind of stone. That's why we always see this repetitive crack. And you can see the same numbers appear on every stone. Maybe the stone is rotated or mirrored and so on, but basically everything is very, very similar. So now the first step that we can do is to play with these coordinates here, right? So for example, I can increase the size of our map in one axis or decrease it. But one thing that we will notice that is a little bit annoying is that, yeah, I will change the values here, but technically I also want that they be updated in the same maps here, right? So that's actually not really possible. So if I change these values here and then I update the map, I can see, let's go back here again, that we can see the change. So this one is the original one, and then we tile it a lot more, and then we update all the maps again. We can see only this one is changing, which is about to be expected. But the good thing is that with these VRay bitmaps, we have the way that we use one texture as a parent to drive the child, right? So basically, I can just use this one here and connect this to the mapping source of the other VRay bitmaps in my scene. And now that means that everything that I adjust in here will also be affected in those ones here accordingly. So if I now go in here and I make a tiling of 4 and 4, and then I update all my previews, you will see that all of them updated now, even though I only changed this one. So that's actually quite handy. So this one is now our parent and those ones are our children. So everything that's happening here will also be affected on those ones. So now we only have to take care about this texture here, that this texture is not so repetitive anymore. So let's just go back to everything here. And what's also interesting to know is that those blur values that are set up in here, they will also be transferred to the children. So if I have a blur value of 1, for example, my normal map would be blurred. And if not, then no of the maps would be blurred, for example. So now let's see what we can do in order to optimize the texture coordinates on our model, because now it looks very uniform. So there's a new node which is called VRayRandomize UV or UVWRrandomizer. And then this node is meant to be used with this VRayBitmap node. So you take it and then you drag it into our master node. And then what's happening is that these kind of variances will be applied. So at the moment, we are offsetting between 0 and 1 in the U and V direction. We are rotating between 0 and 360. And the scale we leave. So the scale is set to between 100% and 100%. So there's no variation of scaling happening. So now we can see something happened. So this stuff here rotated slightly, but what we want is that it doesn't affect the whole model. It affects the whole each stone individually. So there's actually an option for that. So you can choose how these randomizations are happening, and by default they are just happening on the whole object. But we then choose this by element. And now you can see that each stone or each element of our model will get its own totally random UV applied to it, or random UV. The adjustments are happening based on the existing UV, right? So we're sliding a UV between 0 and 1 for each element, and we're rotating it. So for the rotation, you need to be careful, because if you use normal maps, then those ones would also be rotated. And that's not necessarily what you want, because you need to be a bit careful about that the normal information is not being distorted or not being wrong. So if you have a normal map, I would not use this UV rotation necessarily. But like this, you will see that each stone now has different color values applied to it and different numbers. And that means we have now a much larger variation basically across our surface. And now if we go check our normal map, we can see that now every stone has also its own individual normal map, and this always repeating crack disappeared. So that's much better already. And then we have to check, so this one, the UV randomizer, it only works on existing UVs. So what will happen if, for example, let's totally destroy the UVs in here by just adding a planar mapping. And now if we go back in our material editor, so now the UVs basically are kind of destroyed. So our UV randomizer only applies to the existing UVs that are on the model. So if your model doesn't have some correct UVs or some nicely UVs laid out, then this UV randomizer is not necessarily the best step to do it. So in this case, I would recommend to use a VRayTriplanar texture. So let's first of all delete this one here and add a VRayTriplanar texture. And then this one would also be piped into here. And first, it's very, very small. So you can see the very small tiles. And you can choose how big the projections that are happening on our object should be. So for example, let's choose it to 50. And then we get roughly the same size like before. And what's happening now is that this VRayTriplanar texture is projecting the texture from 3 different directions on our object. So basically with a box projection. But the cool thing is that it's trying to blend the edges. So you can see if there's a blend value that I can set up in here. So by default it's set to 0.1. If you set it to 0, then you can see there is some, in this case, actually the transition works kind of good, but for many models, you will see that there is a very ugly transition happening here on the projection borders. So with the blend value, you can try to blend over this transitions, right? So you can see here, this texture is blending over into this texture, and like this way, you can totally try to avoid any kind of visible scenes that you might see on the model. So that's actually quite nice. So what you can also do in the VRayTriplanar texture is that now everything is basically projected from all sides, but each stone is not projected separately. So you will have a repetitive pattern that will transition from one stone to the next. For example, if the normal map here on this stone is like this, then it would be repeating exactly here. So this stone is not totally individual from this stone. So in order to reach this, you can use these random texture offsets. So for example, if you enable this one here, then this node, this option down here appears, and you can then choose how you want to apply those random texture offsets. So we also would choose element here. And now we can see that no matter what our normal map is per stone, it's not being repeated exactly the same way on the other stone. So if we also check in here, we will see that each stone has a slightly different offset applied to it. So what you then can even do is that you map your now existing UV, because now the object has UV, so they're generated while render time with this triplanar texture. So now you can use this UV randomizer and even modify those UVs again if you want to. For example, you could then go in, and what you cannot do with the VRayTriplanar texture is that you have different scaling for each element, but with the UV randomizer you can do that. So for example, we can set the scaling here between 10 and 200. And now we can see some of the stones have a very, very big scaling of a texture applied to it, and some stones have a very, very small texture applied to it. And even everything then is still using the triplanar texture, and you can see this nice blending that's happening here. And because everything is linked together with the master node, all the transitions are also happening in all our other channels. So for example, if you can see a normal map here in this stone is much bigger than it's on this stone, for example. But in our case, we just want to have uniform scaling, so we just put everything back to 100 in here and leave all the other values how they are. And then also decrease the blur value, because now this blur value is the one that's being used. So in order to have a very sharp normal map, this blur value should be set to a very low value. So afterwards, we can then exchange our bitmap here again back to our actual texture. We can see now that all the stones have their own unique normal map applied to it, and they don't use exactly the same texture anymore. So now each stone has its own unique normal map and its own offset of our texture map. So all the stones, they look different now. They're not exactly the same of the same copy of another stone, but what they still share is that they still have the same color values everywhere. So all the stones have exactly the same brightness, and that's what we want to change now. So for this, I would use a composite map. So let's add a composite map in here. And then let's update those previews so that we not get confused anymore. Okay, and then in this composite map, you can add a new map which is called VRayMultiSubTex. And this map is very, very useful because you can easily, by default it creates those 20 different values, and you can choose how those values will be mapped. So at the moment, they would look for face material IDs, and then each ID with a 1 would get this color, and each ID with a 20 would get this color, and all the other ones would also get the according gray value in this case. So because our whole object uses a material ID of 1, everything gets mapped 1, but you can choose different kind of elements here, or different kind of categories. So the one that we want in this case is randomize element. So then every element, every part of our model that's one element, so which has connecting faces, will get one of those gray values applied to it. So in my case, I prepared something already for the finished shader with different color values. Let me just bring that over here and connect this instead. You can see that you can choose your own color values, and then you can blend them together. So I use those values, and then you can choose to overlay, for example. Where is it? Overlay here. And then you can choose a different overlay strength. So now you can see that all of the stones, they have slightly different color, and it immediately looks much more realistic and much more interesting. So now in the scene, I created a ground plane, and you can clearly see what is the issues already. So I have this texture pattern, or this texture tile, that's repeating a lot here across the surface. So let's just hide this one first, and I show you, we can switch this one to a diffuse, and then I show you the setup. It's the same like before. So I use this VRayBitmap node here, which is driving another VRayBitmap node, which is my normal map. So let's now, in order to see better what's going on, we can change the texture to this texture here, and now you can clearly see the different texture tiles that are happening. So now what we want to do is to make those tiles not the same anymore. And there's a very easy way we can do that. Is again using this VRayUVWRandomizer node. And then inside here, let's first enable this mirroring here, so that we remove those borders, which we can clearly see this repetitive pattern. And then inside here, we can use this stochastic tiling. And this one is doing adjustments for each of the tiles based on whatever we set up in here. So if we do that, we can see each of the tile will get their own adjustment, which is totally random, our own rotation and their own offset. And we can even change the scaling, for example. And so some of them will be smaller now, and some of them will be bigger. For example, this one is smaller and this one is bigger. But now what we still have the problem is that we have these edges here, and this one we will clearly see in our map in the end. So there's this additional value here, which is called tile blend. And with this one, if you start to increase it, you can see that it will blend the value between each tiles. So for example, if you choose a value of 0.2, then this transition will become bigger and almost unnoticeable anymore. And like this way, you can use this same texture applied across the surface, but those repetitions are not so obvious anymore because each tile is scaled and rotated individually. So we can then exchange the texture to the one I had before, but enable this tiling again. And now we can see that this time we can't really see an obvious pattern going on. So if we now go back to our RGB color and then unhide our bricks and also this grass that I made, and then we let it update for a second, then we can see that now there's basically no repetitions visible anymore, and the object looks much more realistic than what it did before. So now, just as promised, to show you how the setup works with older version of VRay. So unfortunately, the stuff you saw just now with the floor, that's not available because this UV randomizing node is only possible, or is only available in the latest version of VRay. But what you can do is the trick with the Triplanar texture, but you have to set it up slightly different. So back then you didn't have these VRay bitmaps, and that's why you have to apply this VRayTriplanar texture behind it. So you would do it the same way like what we did before. And then, unfortunately, you would need to copy the same triplanar texture to all different maps, because it's not possible to have the setup with one master that drives the other slaves. So yeah, unfortunately you have to set it up like this, and then whatever value you change here, you would then need to go through all the different maps and then also change it there. So I'm very happy that they simplified this process in the latest version of VRay, and yeah, it makes it much more easy. Okay, so now let's double check the final result again. I think we can clearly see that the changes were very much worth it and they were very easily done. So that basically concludes the end of our tutorial, and yeah, I would be very interested to hear what you think about those techniques. What are your techniques to make models look more realistic? You can leave that down in the comments, and if you like this tutorial, leave a like, and if you want to be updated for future content, be sure to hit the subscribe button. So take care and see you soon.